I am delighted and honored to have been given this opportunity to express my thoughts on education on this auspicious occasion when we remember our first education minister, Maulana Azad. I have heard many things about the legendary nature of Maulana Azad, a scholar par excellence, a nationalist, a freedom fighter, a close associate and follower of Mahatma Gandhi, a worthy colleague of Jawaharlal Nehru. As the story goes, he molded the initial directions that India's education system would take. And there are just two things that I can recount today that have been passed on to me from very knowledgeable and reliable sources. That much as he was a man of the humanities, the liberal arts, there was a critical occasion when those who were responsible for charting India's course very soon after education were trying to contemplate how and what should be emphasized, and most who were present were involved in the process of trying to keep the minister pleased by emphasizing very much on the role that humanities and the liberal arts play. And they said that these are the pillars that will take the country forward. And apparently, as I've been told, Maulana Azad very quietly in his own way said, we have had enough pillars, now let's now build some structures on them. And he said sciences should also be allowed to flourish. That was the kind of liberal, all-encompassing vision that Maulana Azad had. I have also been told that there were occasions when education would be discussed either in the cabinet or on other occasions. He would hold his own in discussions with the Prime Minister. And it was not easy to do that given the stature of the late Jawaharlal Nehru. But Maulana Azad, and I have this on record, held his own views and managed to prevail upon the Prime Minister. So it is but natural that we should remember him on his birthday by celebrating the National Education Day. I'm grateful to Professor Nageshwar Rao that he has remembered me on this occasion. I'm not sure if I am the best choice, but I'm grateful that he has reposed his faith in me, and I will do my best to justify his choice. And the same applies to Professor Sharma, who also has this misplaced sense of faith in me just because he is fond of me. I must admit, though, that education is dear to my heart. And as little as I've understood the march of history, no nation has been able to make progress in the true sense unless they have built their systems of education in the right way. And from what I can understand, there are enough lessons even in India's history that tell us how education should be nurtured for the future. And I mean by lessons that have worked in the past in practical ways. The surest way of making a country progress is to make it economically strong, self-sufficient, recognized in the world. And one of the surest and most sensible ways is education. And I can tell you that in modern times, when I look at those nations that have done well in these senses that I've just enunciated before you, then I find that right at the center of all of these endeavors, the principal reason for success lies in the fact that they have built good institutions of education. No country can make any progress until its economy does well. And if you look at Any country, as I just mentioned, then you will find systems of education behind it that have made it do well. And if you look at India's history, so I refer to the monumental work of Angus Maddison on the economic history of the world from the 1st century AD till about the 18th century. And Maddison's work is monumental by any standards, by any viewpoint. And Maddison has built his work on hard data, facts. And he records that for uninterrupted fashion from the 1st century till about the 18th century, India's GDP dominated global GDP. We were the single largest contributors to global GDP. China was a distant second. So you can see that in this uninterrupted fashion, India's economy played a stellar role in the world, and there was well-being in our land. And as I just said, that these things only happen if your systems of education are worthwhile. And so I was led to delve into what was it that happened in education that made our country economically well off. And as little as I have understood, I think one of the best things that summarizes this is best expressed by what the Mimamsa school of philosophy says. And so long ago, hundreds of years ago, it says that knowledge without action is meaningless. In other words, unless you tie knowledge to practical ends, what is the purpose? And you think carefully, this is what makes a nation's economy go higher and higher. The fact that knowledge is put into action. And that has been India's contribution to the global understanding of education. Whenever I have delved into what people have to say about education, I realize that in one way or the other, we in India had understood this quite well. And I do not speak on a chauvinistic platform. I'm talking of hard facts. As I said, you can look at what Maddison says, and then you start going behind the causes. So if you look at what Pliny, the Roman historian, much before the time of Christ records, and Pliny has put this on record in his writings, that India is taking away all our gold. And it's not doing this by force. It's not that India is invading the Roman Empire. It's just that when India trades with the Romans, we have so much to take from them because they cannot do without what we have. And so they are compelled to take, and in return we take their gold. So what was it that India was doing that compelled Pliny to make this complaint? There were land and sea routes that took us to those lands. Land routes for trade and also sea routes. And in those days, to take a seafaring vessel along the high seas for trade to Africa and beyond, to Europe, was no easy task. And yet, century after century, there are records to show that Indian seafaring vessels consistently and accurately sailed across the Indian Ocean and returned safely. As late as the time of Isaac Newton, records in the British Parliament that as of now, science knows no means of determining position at sea. And why is Newton compelled to say that? Because European vessels were consistently getting lost. They were unable to find their ways, and you have this prime example of Columbus, who set forth to discover India and traveled in the opposite direction. But this is not what happened with Indian vessels. And what evidence do I have? And without seafaring vessels of accuracy and safety, you cannot indulge in profitable trade. And what was it that allowed us to do that? One, Our vessels were extremely well built. There are records to show that Indian seafaring vessels were consistently better built than those that came from Europe. They were sturdier. But more importantly, they knew how to find position at sea. And let me give you some evidence for that. So there is a small island called Socotra off the coast of Madagascar. Its actual original name is Sanskrit. Its name is Sukhadra Dweep, that which gives you joy, pleasure. On that island are a huge number of caves. On the walls of the caves are scrawlings by Indian sailors dating back from since the time of Christ. They write in Sanskrit and in Pali. And what do they write? They write that they have come from India, stopped at this island. Why is it called Sukhadra Dweep? Because over there they are able to replenish their supplies for food and water. And then they move beyond for trade. And then they return and go back to India. That in itself bears testimony that our vessels were able to cross the ocean and come back. But if you go and come back with accuracy, have nothing to trade, then what is the point? There will be no profit. It cannot just be a tourist trip. And therefore, we come to this thought of what is it that they were trading in? And let me tell you something very interesting. So, several hundred years before Christ, when Alexander invaded India, and then the mystery of what we were trading, one of those things will be solved. When he invaded India, he did not eventually cross the Beas River. He stopped on the banks of the Beas River. Western historians have generally recorded that by now his soldiers were tired and they wanted to go back, so he turned away. But Indian history, folk history records with clarity that Alexander's spies crossed the Beas and witnessed the Magadhan army, the powerful, mighty Magadhan undefeated army, arrayed across the river with thousands of elephants, thousands of horses, and thousands of foot soldiers. And they came back and told Alexander that the Magadhan soldiers are waiting eagerly to give you battle, and they had never seen an army like that, and one that had never been defeated. And that is when Alexander actually decided to turn back. He knew that he could not take on the army. But when he turned back, he was a demoralized man. Also, he had already become friends with Porus, with whom they had a battle, and he almost lost to Porus. But then they became friends. So when he was heading back and he was demoralized, Porus gifted him something that cheered him up. This is on record. And do you know what it was? Several ingots, not of gold, of the Woods steel. A steel that only India knew how to manufacture. This was highly valuable, invaluable steel. The famous Damascene talwar, Damascus sword, was nothing but India's Woods steel that was given shape in Damascus. The steel came from India. It was in great demand because that was the only steel that really worked in battle. And India exported that. And when Alexander received the gift of those several, the term they use is talons. We could use ingots of steel. He was happy because he could use them, put them to good use. Where was this knowledge coming from? It was from our knowledge systems. Our knowledge systems, where they had enough chemistry, enough physics, enough metallurgy, and enough knowledge of how to market, that allowed us to export the wood, steel, and bring gold in turn. And if you think that this was the only thing that we could do, you're badly mistaken. There was lots of other things that India would export. I do not know how many of you are conscious of this. There is always a little bit of controversy because of lack of knowledge when these statements are made, which I'm about to make. But There's a very well-known historian of medicine and surgery who has written an authoritative book long ago at the Johns Hopkins University, which is known for its medicine. He records with great detail that India was the first country in the world that invented plastic surgery. I have seen this in the library of the Johns Hopkins University, written by an American historian of medicine who was a professor there at the Johns Hopkins University, one of the foremost universities of medicine. And it wasn't just plastic surgery that India invented. We also invented cataract surgery. And in that book, I have seen explicit diagrams of the kind of instruments for surgery of the finest that were thinner than the thinnest hair. And how could you make those instruments? Because we had the wood's steel. And these ideas, these methods were exported to the West. That is how they became familiar with these surgeries. But this isn't all. India was exporting in many other realms. As late as when Vasco da Gama comes to India, and in my history books in India, when I was in high school, I was told that he discovered the sea route to India. Unfortunately, our historians, for whatever reason, and I do not wish to get into that blame game here, failed to record or understand or discover that Indian sailors were crossing the ocean hundreds of years before the time of Vasco da Gama, as you find evidence at Socotra. But it isn't just that. Vasco da Gama had no idea how to get to India. He reached Africa. And from there, he picks up an Indian navigator from Gujarat by the name of Kana. And Kana takes him straight from Africa to Kerala, right across the Indian Ocean, with accuracy. And how does he do that? Because Kana and Vasco da Gama records this. Our historians, for whatever reason, seem to be shying away from this. I have this on record from a Harvard historian and then from a Portuguese historian, that Vasco da Gama observes Kana using a device to find position at sea called the Rapalgai. What is the Rapalgai? It is a device based on a mathematical principle coming from the knowledge systems of India. That is what was allowing Indian ships to navigate the high seas with accuracy. And that is what, therefore, allows your economy to flourish. And that is what is meant by a knowledge economy. And I've given you just one example. We had mastered systems of knowledge and put it to good use within the country. There is a district in Tamil Nadu by the name of Chengalpattu. I have looked at data of Chengalpattu from a few hundred years before the time of the British, because they were very good at record keeping at Chengalpattu. They must be good at other places, but I have the data of Chengalpattu. In Chengalpattu, half the population was engaged not in agriculture, but in other trades and other skills. And only half was engaged in agriculture. And they had, through technology, mastered the use of water for irrigation purposes by building a system of eries, so Chengalpattu was never deficient in water. I'm talking of Tamil Nadu, Chengalpattu. In modern times, we are forever being told there has been a shortage of water and this and that and this and that. It was so well managed by technology, and that was being used for irrigation. The output of grain in Chengalpattu before the British takeover is significant, extraordinarily high, consistently, the records show. And then the output begins to go down when the British take over and they begin to stifle our economy. We were using our knowledge systems to build irrigation, which allowed us to have good agriculture, which allowed us, therefore, to be prosperous. Knowledge is always put to use, and that is what emboldens a nation to then do other things. And this story is repeated consistently in India's history, century after century after century. It isn't just Chengalpattu, it isn't just this. I came across a book at Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh, which is in my possession. It is a 200-year-old book. 200 साल पहले लिखी गई है. By the then Vice Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh, a man by the name of Robertson. It is a history of ancient India based on Greek and Latin sources. But within that book, which is entirely or almost entirely based on Greek and Latin sources, there is a small portion where it talks about a manuscript that he has come across from the Karnataka region of India. It is in Sanskrit, and it is an astronomy manuscript. So he engages the services of the professor of mathematics at Edinburgh University. And together they decipher the manuscript. And I want you to understand this. One, when they decipher the manuscript, they realize it is mathematical, astronomy based on mathematical readings. That it is the recordings of a night sky in the Karnataka region. And the date on which they say they have made the recording is established by their own mathematics at Edinburgh to be the exact date on which they say they have made the recording. You can do that mathematically. So it is actually dating back to the date on which the recording was made. How old was that date? 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, mathematically established by Edinburgh, date on which the night sky has been read in Karnataka. Just look at that. More importantly, Robertson writes that the mathematics that they have used is of the order of sophistication of spherical trigonometry. I'm sure in high school you must have done plane trigonometry, which you use to do many things like finding heights and distances. Spherical is three-dimensional trigonometry. It's that much more complicated. And India had used spherical trigonometry to understand astronomy 5,000 years ago. No wonder we could chart our positions at sea with such accuracy when we navigated the high seas. That was the reason. And that is how our knowledge was being put to use. We were building nautical tables that were based on knowledge coming out of our systems of education. Those tables allowed us to navigate the high seas. Where did this come from? From our knowledge systems that invented trigonometry. Most people think trigonometry is of Greek or Latin origin. Not in the least. Trigonometry was invented in India. There are records to show that it existed definitely just after the time of the Christ. Maybe much before that because of this manuscript. But at least there are records to show. And then, how did we put it to use? So Indian knowledge systems, why were they studying the heavens? Why did Newton study the heavens? He was really trying to establish times of some biblical events. In exactly the same way, Indian astronomers were studying the heavens just to be able to understand how you could find position. And so in the course of trying to understand astronomy, they built spherical trigonometry, first trigonometry. The words sine and cosine in trigonometry are not of Greek or Latin origin. There were Indian words called jya and kojya, sine and cosine. And from us, they went to the Arabs because we used to trade through the Arabs with Europe. And so knowledge was also being transmitted like that. And so when the Arabs read our manuscripts, they made a translation which was phonetical of jya and kojya as jab and kojab. And the Greeks, when they came across this, they made a literal translation. Jab is a kind of pocket or something of that shape of a sine curve. And so they called it sine. That's the origin. It's Indian origin, which goes all the way there. And what use was trigonometry? As I just told you, to be able to find position at sea. And when we began to understand the movements of planets, there is record now, and I've been to places where the manuscripts are still available. Bhaskaracharya II invents the calculus, which is considered to be one of the finest inventions of the human mind, 500 years before the time of Newton. Newton is credited with inventing the calculus. Actually, Bhaskaracharya not only invents the calculus, he uses it to study planetary motion exactly how Newton does, but 500 years before Newton. The word that he uses for the derivative is the exact same word that Newton uses, tatkalik gati, instantaneous velocity. But he does it 500 years before Newton. So Indian knowledge systems were consistently in harmony. And history records this time and again, time and again. I do not know what has happened to India now. In spite of the fact that we have a policy in place now, the national education policy, that shouts from the rooftops, that connect your education to the well-being of the challenges of society, our systems somehow are refusing to move in that direction. We are still basically textbook and blackboard driven. But India was not like that. The Upanishads are recordings of the great teachers in education of the past. And my favorite Upanishad is the Chandogya Upanishad, historical recordings of the teachings of the great teachers. In the Chandogya Upanishad, we have this episode of the Gurukul of the great Guru Gautam Haridrumat. To Haridrumat's university comes this child for admission. I want you to understand the Indian tradition, and I wish we could do that with a certain degree of open-mindedness and willingness to conform to the wisdom that has worked in the past and has been working in the present in other countries. Why India sleeps, I do not know. You have a policy in place endorsed by the government. What more could you want? And I will come to that in a short while. But let me just tell you what happens when this child of 12 comes to Haridrumat. One more learning here. We did not enroll our children into formal education until they were 12 years of age. Till then, they were homeschooled. There is much wisdom in that, much wisdom. And I have a historian colleague from Delhi University who has researched on education system in the 18th century in Bengal. And he said that tradition was alive till then, at least definitely in Bengal, where children till 12 were homeschooled. And then they went off to higher institutions. And it has worked well for India. That's why medicine records that we dominated global economy. What happens at Haridrumat's Gurukul when this child of 12 comes? Haridrumat says, child, what is your lineage? Because we admit only Brahmins. And the child says that I asked this question of my mother when I set forth for your Gurukul. And my mother said that I have worked as a maid in many homes and many men have taken advantage of me. I do not know who your father is. My name is Jabala. You are Satyakam. Proclaim yourself proudly as Satyakam, son of the maid Jabala. And when Haridrumat hears this, he says, son, I admit you. Because a Brahman is not by birth. Let's pay attention to this. You cannot have good education unless you have an open mind. And what does Haridrumat say? A Brahman is not by birth. A Brahman is recognized by adherence to the truth. That is the hallmark of a Brahman, not by birth. And so, because you speak the truth so boldly, I admit you. You are a true Brahman. I wish we would have that openness in our own minds that the Upanishads extol. But more importantly, does Haridrumat tell him to go recite the Vedas? No. He gives him 100-odd head of cattle. Says, go to the forest and do not return until they have multiplied threefold. Do you know that wealth in those days was always measured by the number of head of cattle you owned? And this was a practical exercise in wealth management, project-based, hands-on, consistently. That is why the Mimamsa philosophy says knowledge should be coupled with action. हमने क्या कर दिया है? ब्लैक बोर्ड, टेक्स्ट बुक और इम्तिहान के बीच में उसको दलदल में धसा दिया है. We have embedded our education systems between talking on the lecturing, talking on the blackboard, using a textbook, and our strange exam systems, which have embedded everything into the quicksand of mediocrity. India must awaken. The policy shouts consistently, don't do that. Connect things to the needs and challenges of the world. The challenge even then and now is wealth management. Economies will not do well if you don't know how to enhance your wealth. And Haridhumat said, come into the forest with this practical project of the highest importance. And when he returns after they have multiplied so many fold, then Haridhumat says that you already have knowledge. Your face is enlightened. Who taught you? And then Satyakam recounts that all his practical experiences gave him that wisdom. But then he also says that I still need some more and teach me. There must be a balance between the theoretical and the skill. And skills are not inferior. Skills and knowledge, as India has consistently emphasized, are just two sides of the same coin. We in India have somehow relegated skills to something inferior. I do not know how we will recognize this, but whomsoever I have admired in the realm of education, in the realm of economic education, have understood this extremely well, understood this consistently. Knowledge and skills feed on each other. They are two sides of the same coin. One feeds the other. It isn't that skills are inferior or knowledge is superior. And I can give you hundreds of examples, but here is Haridhumat's own example with Satyakam. And give me one school of management which teaches you wealth management rather than first using a textbook, giving you some project-based exercises. The Tony Blair Foundation, sir, has just released a report that the only pedagogy that really works is problem-solving practical problems through collaborative projects. They don't say write on the blackboard or give a written exam. I am very hopeful that IGNOU, which has been a pioneer in so many ways, will also be a pioneer in this pedagogy that the national education policy espoused even before the Blair Foundation's report. And now I find consistently universities are changing over to this method world over. No matter where I go, people understand this. What do we do otherwise? And why are we therefore not putting knowledge to the use of the economy? Because our systems are not connected to the needs and challenges of the world, of society, of the country. We teach in abstraction. How do I know that? Because I have been a university teacher for years and years and years. My own discipline is taught in such a way that everybody is really going to be a research mathematician of the order of Srinivas Ramanujan. Whereas 99% of students who even take mathematics when they are compelled to take for no other reason that they couldn't get any other discipline, take it simply because they have no other choices. They don't want to be Ramanujans. The 1% that they want to must be allowed. But what about the vast majority? They find no connection with mathematics and the real world. There is a discipline in mathematics that is taught in every university, even the IITs, called fluid dynamics. Consistently, I have failed to find students who can tell me that they like the subject. And I once conducted an experiment with a large number of students who had studied this subject. And I asked them, how many of you would like to work with me on a project in fluid dynamics? And not one hand went up. And then I said, how many of you would like to help me build a jet fighter? And all hands went up. And they had no idea that I was talking of the same thing. They had no idea. Because they have never been told to use fluid dynamics in practical ways to build an aeroplane. Why do you think we are forever importing aeroplanes? Because our knowledge systems are not geared to the needs of India the way they should be. इसी को आत्मनिर्भरता कहते हैं, जब हमारे knowledge systems इस दिशा में बढ़े आगे. That is the point I'm trying to make. And if you think that I'm talking alone in the wilderness, no, Mahatma Gandhi consistently said that in education, remember, Gandhi was qualified to speak on education like other things only because he experimented. गांधी जी किसी भी चीज पे कुछ भी नहीं बोलते थे जब तक प्रयोग करके वे अपने लिए निष्कर्ष नहीं निकाल लेते थे. And what does he say in education? He first set up a school in South Africa, which he ran himself. Then he set up a university in Ahmedabad that functions till today, a full-fledged university, Gujarat Vidyapeeth. Then at Wardha, he set up a polytechnic for women on its governing body. He put India's foremost scientists, Raman, Bose, all of them. And they say he was against science. पता नहीं कहाँ से लोग ये कैसे निकाल लेते हैं सारे अपने दृष्टिकोण. And then what does Gandhi say? He says, in education, what you do with your hands will enter your heart. But this is not just Gandhi. Rabindranath Tagore 100 years ago says exactly the same thing. He says education in India has been confined to the blackboard and the four walls of the classroom. It has nothing to do with the real world. Think about this. India had understood this. That is why this practical thing of a Rappal guy comes to us in a transdisciplinary fashion. You build something using engineering, but there is theoretical knowledge of mathematics. This business of not interdisciplinary. अभी क्या फैशन हो गया है राव साहब कि जब हम कहते हैं पॉलिसी कहती है कि डिसिप्लिन्स को आपस में लेन देन रखना चाहिए, तो पॉलिसी मेकर्स जो लोकल लेवल पे हैं, व्हाट डू दे से ओके ही इज लर्निंग मैथ्स, गिव हिम वन लेक्चर, वन कोर्स ऑन पोएट्री. दैट्स नॉट व्हाट इट इज अबाउट. It is about how poetry and mathematics interact with each other. Otherwise, this is not transdisciplinarity. And I don't know how many of you are aware that 200 years before the time of Christ, there was a prosodist in India by the name of Pingal, who was trying to build new meters, chand, in Sanskrit poetry by combining permutations and combinations of the existing meters, the sounds, the long and short sounds. But because he knew mathematics, he builds a mathematical device to be able to create new meters. नए छंद का आविष्कार कैसे किया उन्होंने? He invented a device called the Meru Prastar, steps leading to the mountain top. It is a mathematical device that Europe invents 1800 years later, and it is world famous as Pascal's triangle. India had done this 200 years before the time of Christ. That is true transdisciplinarity. Parantu, I have yet to find a single Sanskrit course that allows you to use computer programming and mathematics with chands to see how Pingal went about it and what our students could do. And if they could do that, then Sanskrit would be a far more empowered discipline for the well-being of India, because then genuinely mathematics and computer science would blend with Sanskrit. But we don't do that. And God knows how much we could have invented. God knows how many algorithms, God knows how many apps. If we had understood Pingal's method through IT, the lens of IT and mathematics working together. And we don't have to be afraid that we as teachers don't know this. It is the students who will find the way, become co-journeymen with them. And it will work. You should not be knowledgeable all the time. In any case, we must never teach too much. We must teach them to learn. Not that ये भी पढ़ा दो, वो भी पढ़ा दो और दलदल में उसका दिमाग धसा दो. Don't do that. India had never done this in the past. Look at the freedom that Haridrumat gives Satyakam. कहते नहीं है कि सिलेबस से ये भी पढ़ लो, वो भी पढ़ लो, जाके ये करके लाओ, फिर हम बात करेंगे. But we don't do that. However, sir, just look at other countries. All of us are familiar with Google. It has become synonymous as a search. Google kar lo. But how many of us have tried to understand why this is a prime example of what is called an instrument that builds a knowledge economy? How? So let me tell you. Some years back, I looked at the quarter results of Google. 3 महीने का financial results. उस वक्त गूगल 10 वर्ष पुरानी संस्था थी, 10 years old. उसके पास about it had 10,000 employees. And I looked at all the Indian IT companies, all of them, naam nahi leta, all of them. And each one of them on an average had more than 100,000 employees. बहुत ज़्यादा. And Google akele alone in one quarter was earning more than all the companies put together for the whole year. Why? Because Google runs on a knowledge idea. And our IT companies, with the greatest of respect to them, largely do manual work. There is no knowledge idea driving them. But Google runs on an undergraduate mathematical idea and just smart coding that even a schoolboy can do. But do you find any institution that merges mathematics, IT, search? Has anyone at an undergraduate level tried to get our students to understand how the search engine works? As far as I know, no. And whenever I've tried, I have had astounding results. Astounding results. So I'm not talking in thin air. I've conducted experiments year after year after year for 20 years and more. And I have found how one could blend knowledge with practical needs and enhance economic well-being. So, at Delhi University, at the Innovation Center, we ran some degree programs. One of them was called B.Tech Innovation with Mathematics and IT. But the only prerequisite was that you should have had maths as your 12th grade subject. Even that I feel is not necessary, but sometimes you have to give into some practical considerations. And the first batch, there have been many batches and all of them are doing exceptionally well. But I remember it was a 4-year program, and it still runs as a 4-year program. By the time these kids, the first batch, had entered 3rd year, Google, with whom they were working closely as they were with many other companies, told me that we prefer these students to any IIT or any other institution. Why? Because these were original, inventive students who could put knowledge to practical use. 10 startups came out of that batch. One of them is now a multi-million-dollar enterprise in Silicon Valley. There are others functioning in India with great success. That's how knowledge is put to practical use. And that is what we are doing now in Jammu and Kashmir. We have built a degree there called Design Your Degree. That's the name of the degree. It's in complete conformity with the national education policy. And its pedagogy is collaborative project-based learning. The teacher becomes a fellow explorer. There is a balance between knowledge and practical things. And I remember one of India's leading IT czars went there and gave a lecture, and he came back, and this was when the first batch had spent only 2 months. And he said that these students are geniuses. And I remember the first day when the batch had come from high school and had been admitted, all of us thought, will we be able to succeed with these kids? They're just like every other child is a potential genius. In just 2 months, their minds had been set on fire because they were putting things to practical use all the time. So they worked on Kabir, but also did practical things with Kabir. And this is how you do that. This is how you ignite their minds. Look at any person you admire. Let's pick up, say, Newton. Extraordinarily gifted with his hands, a skilled craftsperson. That is why Newton is able to discover the laws of light. Because he builds things with his hands, and he is a gifted craftsman. You've heard of the Webb telescope, which is NASA has put in outer space, and also the Hubble telescope. I don't know how many of you know this. There are 2 kinds of telescopes. One is a refractor telescope, when you look at the object directly. The other is a reflector telescope, where you reflect on a perfectly ground concave mirror, and then you look at that, not at the object. The object is reflected here. That is a better telescope. That is what the Hubble uses. That is what the James Webb telescope uses. Who invented that? Newton. Newton did that. He was really good with his hands. Einstein, who invented general relativity, such a great theoretical thing, extraordinarily gifted with his hands. He worked on the shop floor of his father's electrical goods factory. And he did such a good job that after a PhD in physics, while he's working in the factory, he decides he will manage the factory because his father is ill. And this is where his ideas are developing on gravitation because he's working with electromagnets. And when his father recovers, he goes and works as a clerk in the patent office, patent clerk, third class. But at the same time, while he's inventing general and special relativity, Einstein invents the world's first automatic camera with his hands. The first modern safe refrigerator. साहब हम तो प्रोफेसर्स हैं, हम हाथ नहीं गंदा करेंगे, हम ब्लैक बोर्ड पे पढ़ाएंगे और इम्तहान लेंगे, 6 सवाल पूछेंगे जो पिछले साल नहीं आए थे उसके पहले आए थे और फिर तुम्हें पास या फेल. हम पास फेल करने में खूब लगे रहते हैं, खुद को तो फेल कर रहे हैं हर साल. India must wake up to this because the national education policy decries all this. And the sooner we do this, the better for India. And it isn't just Google. The fastest growing economic region in Great Britain is the one that exists around Oxford and Cambridge. Because their ideas are giving rise to industry. Startups after startups which are successful. One of the most successful pharmaceutical drugs in the history of pharmacy has come out of Cambridge University. Alexa has come out of Cambridge University. I looked at the campus of Stanford University and the physical area around it. In 2012, there is a study which says the economy of just the campus around Stanford University was worth $3 trillion. 2012 mein. Think about it. Where do we stand? Our best universities have no economy worth the name. But we were not like that, as I've told you. The examples of history tell us something else. That is why I speak today in the memory of Maulana Azad, who sacrificed so much so that we could build a solid platform on education, and consistently government after government has worried about it. But I haven't seen a better national education policy than the one we have today. The tragedy is that I somehow find that we are misinterpreting it or not caring enough. And I urge in all humility that all of us put our shoulder to the task and build India into a true knowledge economy. My last example, India exports goods worth more than $1 billion annually in the form of ready-made garments. Why does India do that? Not because we are very good at tailoring. It's just that labor is cheap here. Nimble fingers exist over. सबके पास है भगवान की देन. यहाँ labor सस्ता है. What we don't seem to recognize is that an American university, using a grant from their defense department, has built a robotic tailor of the perfect kind. What is the true test of a robotic tailor? That it can stitch a perfect circle. That tailor can do that. Our entire export industry is in danger. Nike makes shoes now using artificial intelligence. We won't have to come to Agra to get shoes done. There are hundreds of such examples. India needs to wake up because we, in education systems, the responsibility is ours. We are the ones who are required to foresee the future. We cannot afford to be laid back. And so, in the memory of Maulana Azad, in the memory of this great nation, in the memory of Mahatma Gandhi, and as a tribute to the national education policy, I have given you this address. Jai Hind.